Silent Rancher waited at the depot for days. A weeping bride fainted at his feet. The third morning I was there, Carl Bittner came out of the freight office and leaned against the doorframe and watched me like I was something he hadn't seen before and wasn't sure he wanted to see again. "Harlan," he said. "Carl, train came in yesterday." "I know, I was here." He looked down the tracks the way men look when they're thinking something they don't want to say out loud. "She wasn't on it." "I know that too." He went back inside. I walked to where my horse was tied at the post down the side street, loosened her cinch a notch because I'd forgotten to when I tied her, and then stood there with my hand on her neck for a while. The smell of her. The warmth coming off her in the October cold. After a bit I tightened the cinch again and went back to the platform. That was the third day. I want to tell you about those days and the days before them and what came after. Not because it makes a tidy story. It doesn't. But because I'm sitting here at 62 years old with a woman asleep inside that house right there, and sometimes in the mornings I need to remember how close it came to something else entirely. My name is Harlan Cade. I have run cattle on the same stretch of grass outside of Dalton, Wyoming since 1871. That's I'd have to count. That's 20-some years, give or take. A man stops counting precisely after a while. The land doesn't change enough to mark years clearly. You go by what the grass does. Whether the creek stays honest through August. Whether the winter pushes south from the bighorns early or waits until December to show its teeth. I came to this land when I was 20 years old with a string of 6 horses, $200 I'd saved working another man's cattle in Kansas for 3 years, and the kind of stubbornness that looks like something more dignified in hindsight than it felt like at the time. The land I found was grass and rock and sky and not much else, which suited me because I was not, at 20, a man who needed much else. What I needed was ground I could work and an honest return on the working of it. That was what I got. What the territory gave me over those early years was winters. It gave me springs that came late and falls that went early and summers that were perfect and brief, like something you were meant to admire but not rely on. It gave me drought in 1877 that killed 40 head and nearly broke me, and a wet spring in 1880 that came back double, and a cattle market in 1885 that was the best I'd seen, and a market in 1887 that was the worst. And through all of it I got up before light every morning and went to bed after dark every evening and did the work that needed doing. And after 20-some years of that, I had 800 head of decent stock, a house that didn't leak. A barn that could hold 3 times what I ran, 2,000 acres of deeded ground and water rights that 3 different men had tried to dispute and lost. I am not, by most accounts, a man anyone would single out in a crowd. Medium height. My face has too much weather in it and not enough softness. I do not talk unless something needs saying. My neighbor Walt Ferris once told his wife, she told me later with an embarrassed laugh, that having a conversation with Harlan Cade was like watching a man choose between 2 fence posts. That struck me as about right. I have never been a man who could fill a room by entering it. I have never had the kind of quality that makes strangers lean toward you at a bar. What I have is this: I know cattle, I know grass, I know what a horse is telling you by the particular way she squares her feet and drops her head. I know how to fix what breaks, and out here everything breaks. I know how to wait. I have never been accused of giving up on a thing before its time. Those are not qualities that make a man magnetic, but they are qualities that build something, and I had built something. What I did not have was anyone to sit across from at the table. That is not a complaint. It is a fact the way the bighorns are a fact. You look at them often enough that you stop needing to say anything about them. But I will say this: there are winters. There are winters that go long and go quiet and go dark by 4 in the afternoon, and a man can get through those winters alone, and I had many times, but getting through a thing is not the same as living a thing. There is a difference between endurance and life, and I knew, by the time I was 42, that I had been enduring rather than living for a considerable stretch. I knew it the way you know when the ground is going dry, not all at once, not with any single clear sign, but gradually, the grass going a particular color, the creek dropping, and you understand at some point that what you're looking at is a condition, not just a bad week. I'd had one chance before. 1882, a woman named Clara Hodge who came to work at the Dalton Hotel and had a quality of steadiness I respected. We spoke a few times. She was not interested in ranch life, she said, with no unkindness. She went back to Colorado in the spring. I did not blame her, and I did not pursue it. After that, I'd let the years go the way they went. I wrote the first letter in February of 1893. The agency was out of Chicago, a Mrs. Eleanor Marsh who ran a correspondence column in one of those papers. The letter I sent was not, I'm told, the kind of letter that stirs a woman's blood. It was a list, mostly. The acreage, the stock, the condition of the house and the state of the well, what a woman could expect by way of provisions and a reasonable degree of comfort. What I could not provide by way of company in town, given that town was 14 miles, and I did not ride in except for necessity. I said I was 42 years old. I said I had never been married. I said I was not looking for a woman who wanted the life I didn't have, the townhouse, the society, the Wednesday church suppers with the other wives. I was looking for a woman who could want the life I did have, which was real and hard and not without its satisfactions, and not, in my assessment, without its beauty, though I acknowledged that beauty was a matter of what you were accustomed to looking at. I read that letter over 3 times before I sent it. The third time I thought about not sending it, not because it was wrong, every word in it was true, but because the truth of it was also its limitation. There was nothing in it that would make a woman think, that's the life I've been wanting. I folded it up and sent it anyway because I did not know how to write a different kind of letter, and I was not going to write a false one. Mrs. Marsh wrote back and said I had the most utilitarian romantic correspondence she'd received in 7 years of running the column. She said it not unkindly. She said there was a woman, she would not give me the name, not yet, who had written to her column looking not for charm or promises but for something solid and true. She said, I believe you two might be speaking the same language, which most people don't. I wrote back and said, let me write to her. 6 months of letters followed, between me and the woman whose name was Ruth Connolly from a place in Ohio called Clyde. She was 34. She'd been married before, a man who died in a factory accident in 1889, and she had no children and no family left in Clyde worth mentioning. She was not writing to me looking for a fairy story. She said that plainly in her second letter. She said she had already had a life that was supposed to be one thing and turned out to be another, and she was not interested in more of that kind of surprise. She wanted, her words, a man who was what he said he was, in a place that was what he said it was. I could offer her that. I don't know what else I offered her in those letters. I was not good at it. She would ask me something about the land or the seasons, and I would tell her exactly, sometimes too exactly, sometimes going on longer than a letter should go about something like the way the grass changes color in September, that particular bronze-going gray before the cold locks it down. And she would write back and say she liked when I did that. She said most men describe the West the way they describe a horse they wanted to sell. You describe it like you live in it, she wrote. Like it's the inside of something, not the outside. That letter I read 3 times. I want to tell you about those months of letters, because they were strange months. I had never in my adult life paid the kind of attention to words that I paid those months. I read each of her letters twice before I answered. I had no one to talk to about what I was doing, Walt Ferris knew, in the general way that I'd written to some Chicago agency, and he'd grinned about it in that Walt way, and I'd told him to keep his nose in his own fence lines. So I sat with the letters alone at the table after dinner, the lamp turned up and the stove going, and I thought about what she was asking and what I was saying back. She was a careful writer, not showy, not literary, nothing that made me feel I was out of my depth, but careful, in the way of a woman who'd thought hard about things and took the thinking seriously. She asked questions that were not the obvious questions. She didn't ask if I was a good man, or whether I had my faith, or whether I expected a wife to do this or not do that. She asked what I did on Sunday mornings when I had no particular obligation. She asked what I thought about when I was riding fence, and my mind went somewhere on its own. She asked what I missed about being young, if I missed anything, and what I didn't miss. I told her Sundays, I usually rode out east to a piece of high ground where you could see 50 miles in 3 directions on a clear day, and if there was nothing that needed doing, I just sat there for a while. I told her when I was riding fence and my mind went somewhere, it usually went to whether I was making the right decisions about the stock, whether I was rotating the grazing right, whether the bull I'd bought in 1890 was going to prove himself worth the money, practical things. But sometimes it went somewhere else, somewhere without a clear subject, just open, and those were the rides where I got home and didn't know where the time had gone. She wrote back about that. She said she had a place in Clyde like my high ground, not dramatic, just a spot along the Sandusky River where the bank bent and there was a willow tree, and the light came through it a particular way in late afternoon. She said she hadn't been there since Edmund died, and she wasn't sure why. It wasn't as though it had anything to do with him. She just hadn't gone. She said maybe that was something to think about. I thought about her saying that for a week, about what it meant to stay away from a place you loved for reasons that you couldn't quite name. I wrote back and said, I think sometimes we keep things in reserve without knowing it. Like a pasture you don't graze because you're saving it, only you've been saving it so long you've forgotten what you were saving it for. She wrote back one line. That is the most useful thing anyone has said to me in 4 years. I asked her in September to come. She said yes in October. She would arrive on the 14th of November on the Burlington Northern out of Omaha, changing in Cheyenne and then north to Dalton. The 14th came and went. She was not on it. No wire, nothing. I went back the 15th, went back the 16th. The 16th was the day Carl Bittner came out and asked me with his eyes if I was all right, and I told him with mine that the question wasn't necessary. On the 17th, I got a wire, not from Ruth Connolly, from a woman named Agnes Plum, who identified herself as Ruth's neighbor in Clyde. The wire said Ruth had been taken ill 2 weeks previous, been in a serious state, was improved now but would not be on any train in November. Agnes Plum's wire said Ruth wanted me to know that if I had moved on, she would understand. I stood at the telegraph window and read that wire twice. Then I folded it and put it in my breast pocket and rode home. I did not move on. I wrote to her that evening. I told her that I would be at the depot when she came. I told her to come when she was well. I told her, and this was the most I had said in one letter about the interior of anything, that I had been alone a long time and I was good at it, and that did not mean I preferred it. She wrote back in December. She was better, she would come in the spring. I will not tell you the whole of that winter. You can imagine it or you can't. 800 cattle and 1 man, and the kind of silence that doesn't bother you during the day, when there is work enough to fill every hour and then some, but gets its hands around you at night when the fire's banked and there's nothing left to do but sit. I read her letters. I had 17 of them by then, including the 3 that had arrived while she was ill, written by Agnes Plum and Ruth Stead with terse little updates. She is resting. She is better. She is asking about you, and I told her you had not written anything alarming, which is a very charitable reading of your letter. I hadn't known what to make of Agnes Plum from those letters, but I decided I probably liked her. I kept all of them in the strongbox with the deed papers, which is where I kept anything I did not want to risk losing. Ruth would have found that funny, I think, or maybe not. Maybe she would have understood. I thought about her enough that I had a version of her in my head that was probably wrong, too settled, too certain. The letters were good letters, honest, clear-eyed, a little dry in the way she talked about her life in Clyde, not complaining but not pretending either. She'd had a hard time of it, the years since her husband died. She said once that she'd gotten very good at doing things by herself and wasn't sure if that was an accomplishment or a warning sign. I thought about that line for a long time. I thought, I understand that exactly. And I thought, what do 2 people who are both very good at being alone do with each other? I didn't have a clean answer. But I thought about how 2 pieces of ground that have each found their own level can still be made to work together if the water is right, if the grade between them is read correctly. I thought about how most things that work don't work by being the same. They work by fitting. I went to sleep and got up before light and went to work. There was a week in January, one of those Wyoming weeks where the temperature doesn't come above 0 for 7 days running, and the wind makes the cold into something personal, like it has decided to take it out on you specifically. I lost 4 head that week to exposure and had to pull 6 more inside the barn and doctor them through the nights. I slept about 4 hours out of every 24 for 5 days, and by the end of it I was not in any condition to be sentimental about anything. And I remember sitting at the table on the 6th day when it had finally broken and the temperature had come up to something a man could function in, and I was so tired I couldn't finish a cup of coffee. And I remember thinking about Ruth. Not in a sentimental way, in a practical way, in the way of there should be someone who knows where I am. That was the whole of the thought. There should be someone who knows where I am. I was 42 years old and I had been out in that barn for 5 days, and if I'd gone down out there, if I'd slipped on ice or gotten a kick that laid me out, it would have been Walt who found me eventually, maybe a week later, coming over to check on something. That had always been the way of it, and I had never thought much about it. That night I thought about it. Spring came slow that year. April still had snow in it. May turned warm fast, the way it does sometimes, like the land is making up for lost time and isn't interested in any intermediate stage. The grass came in green and serious, and the cattle moved well, and by the third week of May, I had more done than I usually did by June. She would arrive, the latest wire said, on the 1st of June. I did something that month I hadn't done in years. I went through the house and looked at it with a different eye. Not with the eye of a man who lives there, who knows where everything is and stopped seeing it years ago. With the eye of someone who was going to arrive and see it for the first time. What I found was that the house was functional and weathered and sufficient, and also in some respects dark, in the way that houses get when one person has lived alone in them long enough, dark not because the windows were small or the layout was wrong, but because nothing in the house was positioned for two people. The table was pushed to one corner. The second chair at it was where I stacked newspapers and receipts. The lamp was positioned for one man reading, not two. I moved things. I pushed the table to the center and cleared the second chair. I cleaned the windows, which improved the light considerably. I went to the dry goods in Dalton and bought 2 bolts of cloth, one for curtains because the ones on the kitchen window had seen better years, and one because the woman at the counter, Mrs. Hooper, said she thought a woman coming to a new house might appreciate a proper tablecloth, and I could not immediately think of a reason she was wrong, so I bought it. Walt Ferris came over when he saw my horse at the rail outside the dry goods, and he walked out with me to the wagon, and saw the cloth, and his face went through 4 different expressions in about 2 seconds. "Don't," I said. "I'm not saying anything," Walt said. "Good." He lasted about 10 seconds. "Is that a tablecloth?" I drove home. June 1st was a Saturday. I drove the wagon into Dalton the evening before and put up at the one hotel, which was $3 a night and smelled of pipe tobacco, and something I could never identify, and I lay on the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling and did not sleep much. I had brought the letters with me, all 17, not because I needed to read them again, I knew them well enough, but because they were something I didn't want to leave behind. I put them on the bedside table and they stayed there, and I looked at the ceiling. I thought about the first time I'd read her description of her house in Clyde, the 2-room rented house on the edge of town, and the small garden she kept out back, tomatoes and green beans and 1 row of sunflowers that served no practical purpose, but which she said she planted anyway because she liked the way they turned. I had tried to picture that garden and couldn't quite, because my frame of reference for gardens was function, and a row of sunflowers that only turned in the light did not fit in any frame I had. I'd thought about that for a few days, and then I'd gone out and stood in the field east of the house where the wild sunflowers grew in August, and I'd looked at them turning, and I'd thought, I understand now. The train was due at 11 in the morning. I was on the platform at 9:30. Walt Ferris happened to be in town. Walt ran a small spread 8 miles east of mine, good man, not much for minding his own business. And he came and stood next to me around 10 o'clock and said, "She coming today?" "That's the plan." "You nervous?" I looked at him. "Right," Walt said. "Never mind." He went to the dry goods store. The train was 20 minutes late. I watched it come in from the south, the smoke first, then the sound, then the shape of it. I had my hat in my hands because I'd taken it off without thinking and then didn't put it back. People came off the train. A family I didn't know. 2 men who looked like drummers, a young couple who were clearly together, laughing about something. An older man who moved like his knees bothered him. And then the car emptied, and the conductor stepped off and the platform went quiet. I put my hat back on. The conductor was looking at his watch. He glanced at me just a flicker and then looked away. I walked to the car door and looked inside. Empty. I walked the length of the platform. I walked it again. I asked the conductor if there had been anyone remaining on board, and he said, "No, sir, all disembarked." I stood there for a while. Then I went and sat on the bench at the end of the platform, the one in the sun, and I sat there until the train pulled out and the sound of it faded north. No wire came that day. I drove home that evening. Not much to say about that drive. The light went long and flat over the grass, and the horse knew the road, and I let her take it. I didn't think much. I watched the light. I thought once about the letters in the strongbox. I thought about the note I'd written before I came to town, left on the kitchen table for no one in particular, saying, "Gone to Dalton, back Saturday." And I thought about how I'd written it and then looked at it and thought, Who am I leaving this for? Nobody was going to read it. I'd taken it off the table and put it in my pocket and driven to town. The wire came 2 days later. It was not from Ruth Connolly. It was from Agnes Plum again. It said, Ruth took the train. She changed in Cheyenne. There was trouble. I don't know the details. She is not well. She may have continued north regardless. That was all. I read the wire 4 times. I read it until the words stopped meaning anything and started just being shapes. Then I hitched the wagon and drove back to Dalton. I found out later, piece by piece, what had happened to her. I'll tell it here in one go rather than the way it actually came to me, which was over several days in fragments, each one worse than the last. She had been on the train, the Burlington Northern out of Omaha, right on schedule. She'd changed in Cheyenne without trouble and boarded the northbound. And then somewhere between Cheyenne and Laramie, a mechanical failure, a hotbox on one of the freight cars, or so the railroad said, and the train had been pulled into a junction town 20 miles east of Laramie called Hannah, which was just enough of a town to have a telegraph office and not much else. They'd been told repairs would take 6 hours. The repairs took 2 days. She had no money to speak of, not no money, but not enough for 2 days in even the mean kind of rooming house. And she'd been put up with a family in Hannah who let out a room, which was decent of them. But she'd been 3 days on the train already and not eating well. And the waiting and the damp and something in the air in Hannah, or maybe just everything accumulating. She'd gone down sick on the 2nd night. A fever that put her flat for a day and a half, which meant by the time the train moved and she was on it again, she was wrung out and not making her best decisions. She'd made one wrong one in Laramie, getting off to ask someone something and getting turned around and ending up on a southbound platform instead of a northbound. She'd caught it. But by then the northbound was gone, and she was in Laramie with a fever and $15 and a trunk she couldn't move by herself, and the next northbound wasn't until morning. She'd spent the night in the Laramie depot on a bench. That is what I know, that is what I pieced together. When I think about her on that bench in the Laramie depot, $15 and a fever and nobody who knew where she was. When I think about that, I think about what she could have done, which was wire Agnes Plum for help and go back to Ohio, and she didn't do it. She got on the northbound in the morning and she came. That was the start of the depot days. 3 days I waited, different train times, morning and afternoon. Carl Bittner brought me coffee the 2nd morning, just set it on the bench beside me without saying anything. That was decent of him. He asked me nothing, which was more decent still. A man down the platform, a stranger waiting on a freight, had looked at me the first morning and said, "Waiting on someone?" And I'd said yes, and he'd said, "She late." And I'd said something to the effect that the matter was ongoing, and he'd studied me for a moment and moved to the other end of the platform. I did not mind. On the 3rd afternoon, the southbound came through, not my train, the southbound, going the other direction. And it slowed for water and a few of the passengers got off to stretch on the platform. And I was sitting on my bench, and I watched the car doors because by then I was watching all of them out of something that wasn't quite hope anymore. More like habit. A woman appeared in the doorway of the 2nd car. She was not what I had made up in my head over the winter. She was thinner than I'd imagined, thin in the way of someone who has recently been ill, the hollow quality around the eyes, the care with which she was gripping the doorframe. Dark hair. A brown traveling suit that had seen better days or maybe just better weeks. She stood in the doorway and looked at the platform, and her face did something complicated that I watched happen and could not name. She took one step down, and then her legs just went. I was up and moving before I understood why. I got to her as she went down, caught her before the platform got her, and it wasn't graceful. We both went to one knee, her against me, my arms around her, and she was lighter than she should have been, and I could feel the heat off her even through her coat. She was weeping, not loud. The quiet kind that's worse. That means a person has been at it long enough that the sound has worn off but the rest of it hasn't. She said something, I couldn't hear it. I said, "I've got you." She said, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I kept going the wrong way in Cheyenne. They rerouted us and I got on the wrong train, and then I was sick in Laramie and I waited 2 days and I couldn't wire. There was no wire office near where they put us. And I thought you'd be gone. I thought you'd be gone, and you'd have every right to be gone, and I'm not gone," I said. She pulled back just enough to look at me. Her eyes were dark and wet and very direct. She looked at me the way very few people had ever looked at me, like she was actually seeing me, actually tallying up the whole of what she found, not deciding what she wanted to find first. The way you look at something real, not something you've already made up your mind about. She said, "How long have you been here?" 3 days. She closed her eyes. She pressed her face against my shoulder. I was still kneeling on the platform boards, and my knee was going to say something about that later, but right then I didn't feel it. I held her. After a minute she said, into my coat, "I didn't think men like you were real." I didn't know what to say to that. I said, "I'll get you somewhere to sit." She made a sound that was almost a laugh. "All right," she said, "all right." I got her to the hotel. Mrs. Calhoun, who ran the place, took one look at Ruth and took over in that way women sometimes do, which I was grateful for. She got her into a room and got her horizontal and got some soup going from the kitchen, and I sat in the hallway outside the door for about an hour until Mrs. Calhoun came out and said she was sleeping. "She's had a time of it," Mrs. Calhoun said. "I know. You her man." I thought about that for a second. "I'm meant to be," I said. Mrs. Calhoun looked at me for a moment in a way that reminded me of Ruth's look on the platform, though softer, like she'd just filed something away. "Well," she said, "she needs a few days before anything. She's wore down to nothing." "I know," I said. "I've got time." I stayed in Dalton 4 more days. I had not planned to. I had cattle that needed attention, and Walt Ferris was good for emergencies, but not for 4 extra days. I sent Walt a wire. Walt wired back, "Fine, go ahead, say hello to the bride." Walt was a better neighbor than he was a mind-his-own-business man. Ruth slept most of the first day. The second day she was sitting up when I knocked, and she let me in, and we sat in the 2 chairs by the window and talked. Or I let her talk mostly, because she had things backed up in her that needed to come out, and I am a better listener than I am a talker. She talked about Ohio, about her first husband, Edmund, who had been a decent man and a bad fit for factory work, meaning he was too careful and careful men moved too slow around the equipment, and Edmund had moved too slow one morning, and that had been that. She talked about the years after, working as a seamstress for a merchant family in Clyde, living in a rented room, saving money, trying to decide whether she was still a person whose life had a direction or just a person whose life had already happened, and she was writing out the rest of it. She said, "I was not unhappy. I want to be clear about that. I was not unhappy the way some women in my situation were unhappy. I was standing still. And I kept thinking, I'm 34 years old and I am standing perfectly still, and if I stand still another 10 years, I will have stood still my whole life, and that will have been my choice, won't it? That will have been what I chose." I said, "So you wrote the letter?" "I wrote the letter," a pause. "And then they matched me with you. And your letters were—" She stopped. She looked out the window at the street, which was doing nothing of particular interest. "They were not what I expected." "I know," Mrs. Marsh told me. "She told you too," Ruth laughed, the first full one I'd heard, and it was good, it was real, it had some gravel in it. "What did she say?" "That I had the most utilitarian romantic correspondence she'd received in 7 years. She laughed again. "She told me you sent her a letter that read like a livestock inventory." "That's fair." She looked at me. She'd been doing that, looking at me. Not the nervous way some people look at strangers, all quick glances and looking away. The steady way. "But that wasn't really what they were," she said. "Was it?" I waited. "The letter about the grass. The one about the way the grass changes in September. I remember writing it. That wasn't a livestock inventory." I looked at my hands. My hands were what they were, rope-worn, knuckle-heavy, the hands of a man who'd been doing physical work since he was 12 years old. I said, "I wanted you to know what you were coming to, the real of it, not what I thought you wanted to hear." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Do you know how rare that is?" I did not answer that because I did not have an answer that wasn't going to come out wrong. She said, "I read that letter about the grass and I thought, this is a man who actually lives somewhere, who is actually inside his life. Not performing it." I looked up at her. She met my eyes and held them and said, "I thought, that's the kind of man worth traveling to." We talked for 2 hours that day and 3 the next. I'm not going to pretend it was all smooth. She was a woman with opinions and she held them in a direct way, which I respected, and some of those opinions landed differently than she meant them, and some of mine did too. She said something the second day about how she expected the house would need work, said it matter-of-factly, not as a complaint, and something in my voice went a little flat when I answered, because I had in fact been working on the house for 3 weeks before I came to town. She noticed the flatness. She said, "Did I say something wrong?" I said no. She said, "You did that thing you do in letters sometimes, where you answer a question in a way that technically answers it but shuts the door." I sat with that. I said, "I moved things around in the house so it would work for 2 people. I put the table in the center." She was quiet. She said, "I didn't know that." I said, "I know." She said, "I shouldn't have assumed." I said, "I should have said." And that was that. That was us, basically. That was the shape of it, visible already in those 2 days in the hotel. I learned things. She'd read more than most people I knew. She had views on land management that were not uninformed. Her uncle had run a grain farm in Illinois, and she'd spent summers there as a girl, and she understood the relationship between water and soil in a way that most women I'd met had not been required to. She asked me once about my rotation, whether I rested my western pasture in odd years or even, and when I told her, she asked a follow-up question that showed she'd actually thought about what I'd said, which was more than Walt Ferris ever managed. She could sew and she could cook, and she was not going to pretend those things defined her, and I was not going to pretend they defined what I needed. What I needed was someone to sit across from at the table, someone who was inside their life. She knew how to be quiet. That mattered to me more than I could have said. There are people whose silences demand filling, who go tense and uncomfortable if no one's talking, and their discomfort becomes everyone's problem. She was not that. She could sit with a silence and let it be what it was. I found this out on the afternoon of the second day, when we had talked a long time and run natural and easy into a quiet stretch that went on maybe 10 minutes, just the sound of the street outside and the occasional voice in the hall, and I waited for her to fill it with something unnecessary, and she didn't. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked out the window and was just there. After a while I said, "You're not going to say something." "Not if there's nothing to say," she said. On the third day she was well enough to walk. We went down the main street of Dalton, which took about 4 minutes at a stroll, and then turned around and came back. She looked at everything. She looked at the hardware store and the dry goods and the small adobe building that served as a combination post office and land office, and the saloon she did not look away from with any particular discomfort. She said, "It's smaller than I thought." "It's small," I said. "Is that where you get what you need?" "Mostly, I go to Sheridan for the rest." "How far is Sheridan?" "Day's ride. Sometimes I take the wagon 2 days." She nodded. She was looking at the mountains to the west. They were showing off that day, which they did sometimes, the light hitting them at the angle that makes them look painted rather than real. "Those are the bighorns," she said. "That's them." She was quiet for a bit. Then, "Your letters made them sound like something that had always been there and always would be, like you were just living in their vicinity." "That's about right." She made a sound, something between a hum and a sigh, but not unhappy, like a person setting something down they'd been carrying. On the 5th day I asked her. Not the way you might imagine. We were not standing in the street with the mountains behind us. We were at the table in the hotel dining room eating breakfast, which was eggs and bread and not much else, and I had been thinking about it since the morning I'd caught her on the platform, and I decided that thinking about it longer was not going to make it come out better. I said, "I'd like you to come to the ranch." She looked at me. "I mean, and here I was working at it, which doesn't come naturally. I mean as my wife, if you're still willing. I know the trip was hard and you've been ill, and I know this is not what you imagined when you imagined it, and I know I am not easy company. I don't intend to change that last part, but I would like you to come." She had her coffee cup in both hands the way people do when they're thinking. She looked at me over it. She said, "Harlan, I rode a train 3 days and got sick in Laramie, and got on the wrong connection in Cheyenne, and had to wait 2 days in a warehouse town to get rerouted and arrived at the wrong depot and fainted on the platform." "I know," I said. "I did all of that to get here. I waited." "Why do you think I did that?" she said, "if I was going to say no?" We were married in Dalton 3 days later in the front room of Pastor Hughes' house because the church was being re-roofed. Walt Ferris came in and stood with his hat in his hands and grinned the way Walt grinned about things that weren't his business, which was most things. Mrs. Calhoun cried, which surprised me. Mrs. Calhoun did not strike me as the crying type. The ceremony was short. Ruth had made no fuss about its brevity. When I'd said I expected she might want something more elaborate, she'd looked at me with an expression I was learning to recognize, a kind of dry patience, like she was waiting for me to catch up to what was obvious, and said, "I came 4 days on a train. I don't need a long ceremony. I need to get where I'm going." She wore the best dress she'd brought, which was blue and had been pressed by Mrs. Calhoun that morning. She stood next to me, and she was small, but she stood like she wasn't. And when Pastor Hughes got to the part about the vows, she said hers clearly and without hesitation and looked straight at me while she said them. I said mine back to her. I meant them. That is all I have to say about that. The drive out to the ranch was 9 miles and took a while in the wagon. She sat next to me on the board and asked questions about the cattle, about the water situation, about whether I'd had trouble with the grass this year or whether it had been a good spring. Real questions, the kind that needed real answers. I gave her the real answers. About 2 miles out, she fell quiet, and we rode for a while without talking, which I liked more than I thought I would, that particular silence, full rather than empty. The grass was doing what it did in early June, green all the way to the horizon, the afternoon light going long. She said at some point, "I kept thinking about something on the train before I got sick." "What's that?" "I kept thinking, what if I get there and he's already gone? What if 3 days is too long and he's gone and I don't?" She stopped. She said I didn't know what I'd do. "I wasn't going to leave," I said. "I know that now. I wasn't going to leave before I knew either." She turned and looked at me. The afternoon light was in her face, and she was looking at me that way she had on the platform, tallying me up, taking me in like something she intended to know. "I know," she said, "I know." She put her hand on my arm, just rested it there, her hand on my forearm over the coat, not gripping, just there, like something settling into place. I kept my eyes on the road, but I felt it. I felt it the way you feel the exact moment the weather turns. When we came over the last rise and the ranch came into sight, house, barn, the pens, the grass going south and west to a tree line along the creek, she didn't say anything for a moment. I waited. She said, "It's real." "Yes," I said. "I thought it would be. I thought it might be less than how you described it. People usually make things sound better than they are." "I didn't." "No," she said, "you didn't." She looked at it for a while as we came down the slope toward the gate. "It's exactly what you said it was." I pulled up at the gate and got down to open it, and she looked at the house, and I watched her face as she did, that inventory look, and I thought, she is deciding if this is something she can want. Not something she can endure, something she can want. And I did not know the answer, and I did not try to influence it, and I stood there by the gate post in the afternoon light and waited. She said, "I like the table in the center." I had not told her about moving the table. I had told her I'd moved things for 2 people, but I had not specified. She must have been able to see it through the window from the wagon. I said I thought it made more sense there. She nodded once. "It does," she said. "Let's go in." I am going to tell you about the first year, because the first year is what makes everything else make sense. It was not easy. I want to be honest about that. 2 people who are both very good at being alone, learning to be less alone with each other, that takes time and has its friction, and ours had plenty. The kitchen was the first thing. She had her ways of doing it and I had mine, and my ways were the ways of a man who had been cooking for himself for 20 years, which meant they were efficient and monotonous and not particularly interested in what things tasted like, only in whether they had calories and were ready in under 30 minutes. She, on the other hand, cooked the way her mother had apparently cooked, which was with attention and time, and a consideration of what went with what that had never entered my kitchen before. The first week she made a stew that took most of an afternoon and used a combination of herbs I didn't recognize, and I ate it and it was good. It was genuinely good, in a way that my food had never been, and I told her so. She looked at me like she was waiting for the rest of the sentence. I said, "That's it, it was good." She said, "All right." And then she said, "What do you usually make?" I told her. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "We're going to expand your range a little." I said, "Is that right?" She said, "Yes," and she did. She'd look at things I'd built or repaired and ask questions. Not challenging questions. She wasn't second-guessing my methods. but curious ones, the kind that meant she was actually trying to understand the logic of a thing. Why I built the fence posts at a particular angle in the north pasture. How I decided to lay out the pens for the fall roundup. What my thinking was on the water rotation in dry years. She asked those questions and listened to the answers and sometimes asked another one and sometimes just nodded. I had never in my life had anyone ask me those questions and actually listen to the answers. Walt Ferris, for all his good qualities, was not a man who listened to another man's reasoning. Walt listened to the result and made up his own mind about the reasoning, which is fine. That's how most people are. But there is something about being asked how you think that you don't know you've been missing until someone does it. It makes you aware that you've been doing your thinking in an entirely private room for a very long time. She was also direct in a way I had to get used to, not harsh, not unkind. But if she had a thought, she said it, and if she thought I was wrong about something, she said that too, without apology but without malice. The first time she told me I was wrong about something to do with the kitchen garden she'd started putting in, a question of spacing that I had an opinion on and turned out to be misinformed about, I went quiet for about 3 minutes. She watched me. Then she said, "That went over badly." I said, "No." She said, "It did a little." I said, "I'm not used to it." She said, "I noticed." And then she said, without any self-satisfaction in it, "You're also not wrong about everything, mostly not wrong, actually." I thought about that for a few days. I thought, she's not telling me I'm wrong to take me down. She's telling me I'm wrong because that's what you do when you're actually talking to someone, when you're actually in the same world with them. You tell them the truth. I started telling her things I wouldn't have said before, small things at first. What was worrying me about the South herd, whether I thought we should run more stock or fewer and why. She didn't always have an opinion on those things, but she had them sometimes, and even when she didn't, the telling was different from not telling. In August of that first year, I rode out to check the fence on the east boundary, and I was out longer than I planned and came back later than I'd said. And when I came in, she was sitting at the table, and she looked at me with a look that had something in it I hadn't expected. Not anger. Concerned, she said, "You were late." I said, "I know, I'm sorry, the fence needed more work than I thought." She said, "Next time send word if you can." I said, "All right." And then I said, "Were you worried?" She looked at me for a moment. She said, "Yes," just that, yes. I had not had anyone worry about where I was in a very long time. I had gone out before light and come back after dark for 20 years, and nobody had been sitting at the table wondering. I thought about that on the way to the barn to put up the horse. I stood there with my hand on her neck for a while, not thinking anything in particular, just feeling the weight of it. I have been married to Ruth Cade for going on 11 years. I am not going to tell you it was all easy. Marriage is not easy. Ranching is not easy. Two people who are both very good at being alone, learning to be less alone with each other. That takes time and has its rough passages, and ours had them. There were winters she missed Ohio in a way she tried not to show me, and I saw anyway. The second winter, December going long and cold, she went quiet in a way she wasn't usually quiet, a turned inward quiet, and I didn't push it and she didn't offer it. Then one evening she said, without looking up from her mending, "Agnes Plum's youngest had a baby last week." I said I was glad to hear it. She said, "I know." That was all. I thought about what it meant to be far from the things you knew, the things you were woven into, and have them keep happening without you. I didn't say that. I said, "We could go to Ohio in the spring if you want. I can arrange it." She looked up. She said, "You'd do that?" I said, "The ranch doesn't go anywhere." And we went that May, and she spent 2 weeks in Clyde with Agnes Plum and saw the baby and walked out to that spot along the Sandusky River with the willow tree. And when she came back to the hotel where I was waiting, she had a different quality, like something had been set right. And there were summers I got too deep in the work, and surfaced to find I'd been gone from her in the ways that matter without going anywhere physically. I have thought about that since, about how a man can be so accustomed to being alone inside himself that he goes there without noticing, goes into that private room and closes the door and forgets that the door being closed is a thing that someone else can see. She told me about it once, not with anger. Just plainly the way she told me most things. She said, "You were somewhere else this week. I don't know where and I'm not asking. I just want you to know that I noticed." I said I was sorry. She said, "Don't be sorry, just come back. When you realize you're gone, come back." I said, "All right." And I tried. I cannot say I was always successful, but I tried. We worked it out. She knew her own mind and told me it, which I needed more than I knew. I knew the land and kept us on it, which she trusted me to do. We built things together. A root cellar the year after she arrived, a proper kitchen the year after that, a set of pens that made the fall roundup go twice as fast. She started keeping her own accounts for the household and turned out to be better at the numbers than I was, which I admitted without much pain and which she did not rub in. In 1898, we had a scare. She was ill that summer, not like the fever on the train, worse than that, the kind of ill where the doctor from Sheridan came out twice and looked serious both times and said things about rest and time and gods. Well, that did not, in my experience, mean anything good. I am not a man who prays. I have never known quite what to do with that kind of conversation. But I sat up with her 3 nights in a row that week, and I talked to her, which I don't usually do, just talked to keep the room from being quiet. Told her about the cattle and the grass and the things I'd been noticing about the creek and the fence and the weather, all the ordinary catalog of a ranch, and she slept through some of it and was awake for some of it. And when she was awake, she listened and sometimes said something small, and once she said with her eyes closed, "Keep talking. It helps." So I kept talking. She came back, not all at once. It was 2 months before she was herself again, but she came back. I have thought about those 2 months, about what the ranch would have been without her in it. I have thought about what I would have gone back to, that particular silence. It is not a thought I spend time on, but I have had it. I have sat across from her at dinner 8,000 times, roughly. I have not once wished I was sitting there alone. There is a thing I want to tell you about. One evening in the second winter. We'd had a hard fall, lost 11 head in a storm in October, which was money and also just grief, because you don't run cattle that long without it being more than money. And I was sitting at the table after dinner not saying much, which is not unusual for me, but that night there was a weight to it that I could feel myself, and apparently she could too. She sat down across from me. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, "Tell me." I said there wasn't much to tell. The stock was diminished. We'd make it up in the spring if the spring was decent. She said, "That's not what I mean." I looked at her. She said, "I know you. You're not worried about the spring. You're somewhere else. Tell me where." I sat with that for a long time. Outside, the wind was doing what wind does in Wyoming in November, which is to make you grateful for walls. I said, "I've run this place alone a long time. I got good at it. And then something goes wrong and there's a part of me that still recalculates like I'm alone. Like I've only got what I have and it's going to have to be enough." She was quiet. "I know you're here," I said. "I'm not saying I don't know that." "But you forget to let it count," she said. That was it exactly. That was the right words. I said yes. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. Not the gesture of someone performing a comfort, the gesture of someone who meant it. She said, "You've been enough. You've always been enough. You don't have to keep proving it." I don't know how long I sat there with my hand under hers. Long enough. The wind went on outside and the lamp burned low and she didn't move her hand and I didn't move mine. After a while she said, quiet, "You waited at that depot for 3 days. I said I would come." "I know, but there are men who say they'll come and then they go over the numbers and decide it's not worth it. You waited 3 days. That's not a small thing, Harlan. That's the whole answer." I looked at her in the lamplight. This woman who had made a hard trip to get to a hard place to be with a man who was not easy, and had done it without complaint and without pretense, and had been here 2 winters now, and was still looking at me like that, like she saw what I was, and had decided it was what she wanted. I said, "I'm glad you were on that train." She smiled, a real smile, the one that went all the way up. She said, "I'm glad you were on that platform." Walt Ferris came over a few weeks after that, the way Walt did, nosing around some pretext about a fence line, and he ended up staying for dinner the way Walt always ended up staying for dinner. He and Ruth had gotten to a comfortable place by then. She was not charmed by Walt's cheerful nosiness, which somehow made him respect her more, and he had stopped trying to charm her and just talked to her like a person, which she appreciated. They disagreed about politics in an amiable way over dinner, and I sat between them and ate. At some point, Walt looked at the 2 of us, Ruth passing me the bread, me knowing what she needed at the table before she had to ask. The ordinary shorthand of 2 people who have been in the same rooms long enough, and Walt said, "I'll be damned." "What?" I said. "Nothing," Walt said. He had his thinking face on. You're different." "Same as I've always been," I said. Ruth looked at Walt. She said, "He's the same." "The house is different." Walt looked between us. He laughed, that real Walt laugh, the whole face in it, and helped himself to more bread and let it alone. But I thought about it, what they'd both said. Walt's word different and her correction, the house is different. I turned it over for a few days. The house is different. Same ground, same cattle, same pair of hands, same face that has too much weather and not enough softness. But the house is different. The table in the center, the lamp positioned for two, the sound on the stairs in the morning that is hers, particular and known. The way a place feels when someone else is living in it, not just using it. You do not know what you are missing until you stop missing it. That is not a complaint about the years before. Those years made me what I am, and what I am is what she found worth coming to. But I know the difference now between a life that is gotten through and a life that is lived in. This morning I got up before her, the way I usually do. Made the fire, put the coffee on, stood at the window and looked out at the grass, which is doing that October thing now, that bronze going gray, the color I wrote her about before I ever met her, the color I tried to make real in a letter to a woman in Ohio who said she was tired of standing still. She came down while I was standing there. I heard her on the stairs. She has a particular sound on those stairs, a particular rhythm, unhurried. And then she was beside me at the window, wrapped in the blanket she brings down some mornings, and she looked out at the grass, and then she looked at me. She said, "It's doing that thing." "Yes," I said. "The bronze thing." "Yes." She leaned her head against my shoulder. Outside, the bighorns sat where they'd always sat, doing nothing more or less than existing, which has always seemed like enough. I put my arm around her. We stood like that for a while. The coffee was ready, but neither of us moved toward it. The light was coming up slow the way October light does, gradual and serious, not asking anything of you. The cattle were somewhere in the south pasture, probably already moving. The creek would be low by now this time of year, but honest. Everything where it was supposed to be, everything doing what it did. She said after a long while, "Worth it." Just those two words. I did not say anything. I held her there in the morning, the two of us looking out at the grass, and the house was warm behind us, and outside the land ran on to the mountains the way it always had. The light kept coming. That was enough. That was more than enough.